Welcome to today's webinar on protecting New York's election systems. My name is Mark Levine, and I'm the Deputy Director of the New York State Association of Counties. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your demanding schedule to participate in this fourth in a series of cybersecurity trainings co-sponsored by NYSAC, the New York Conference of Mayors, the Association of Towns, the New York Municipal Insurance Reciprocal, and the Center for Technology and Government at the University at Albany. Since the US government acknowledged foreign intrusion attempts in 2016, election security has been an increasingly hot topic for discussion. That's when NYSAC first got involved in cybersecurity. The governor's office alerted us and brought us into regular meetings with the State Board of Elections, the state police, the FBI, and the state's Office of Information Technology Services. Since then, the New York State Board of Elections has worked with county boards of elections and county IT directors to identify and remediate security gaps while also establishing a whole of government approach to monitoring and responding to security concerns during the election period. And I want to thank the State Board of Elections and NYSTEC, and of course, our local boards of elections for all of the work, and it's been a lot of work to secure our election systems. Today, the New York State Board of Elections representatives will review these activities and outline how other parts of the county government can and do support election security efforts, including statewide security assessment, cyber incident response procedures, intrusion detection, managed security services, risk remediation grants, security consulting services, cybersecurity, and election day operations. Jeanette, before we introduce our speakers, you have some housekeeping. I want to thank Jeanette Stanziano, the director, the NYSAC Director of Education and Training, for coordinating this webinar. Jeanette?
Thanks, Mark. Just a couple of key housekeeping issues before we begin. We customarily record all of our webinars, and you can find a copy of today's recording on the NYSAC website at nysac.org under webinars. Just look under the archive section for today's date. We also encourage you to feel free to submit questions for our presenters at any time during the program. We ask you to do so by clicking on the questions tab on your dashboard and typing in your questions. We will get to those questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Thanks, Mark. Back to you.
We have two distinguished speakers today from the State Board of Elections who are national and state experts in cybersecurity, and we appreciate their time today. The first is Ben Spear, who's the Chief Information Security Officer for the New York State Board of Elections. And we have Michael Haber, who's the Chief Information Officer for the New York State Board of Elections. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Mike Haber.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Jeanette. Just by way of very quick introduction, since Mark just told you who we are, and it was a great synopsis of the kind of historically how we got to where we are with cybersecurity and the State Board of Elections. I first joined the State Board back in 2016, just about this time of year, right before a very pivotal election, and cybersecurity was really just rearing its head as something that boards of elections across the country really needed to take very seriously. And since that time, it was just this year that I moved to my current position as Chief Information Officer. Over those 6 years now, cybersecurity has completely ramped up in terms of our importance to the State Board, and as elections was designated critical infrastructure, as was mentioned. So let me give you just a quick overview of the roles and responsibilities of the State Board. And I try not to be one of those guys who's just going to read the PowerPoint slides to you. But we are a bipartisan agency. And it's important to realize that. We like to say around here that we're kind of like a Noah's Ark. Everybody comes in twos. So we have two executive directors, one appointed by the Republican Party, one appointed by the Democratic Party. We have two heads of our operations unit, two sets of counsel's office, and so forth. So we are also governed by four commissioners, two Democrats, two Republicans. That bipartisan nature is meant to keep things very much on the up and up, and to make sure that we have to cooperate together and that elections are truly fairly administered here in New York. Overall, our agency is vested with responsibility for administering and enforcing all the laws related to elections here in New York State. We oversee all the county election administration compliance with not only state laws, but also federal election law. And we also oversee campaign financing, particularly, recording who's running for office, what financing they are receiving, donations, etc. We have total about 115 employees, as it says here. We are growing all the time, and they're spread across the 9 units that you see listed here. So apart from ourselves in IT and the executive officers and the administrative unit, we have our councils, our public information office, our enforcement, public campaign finance, compliance, and election operations. Next slide, please. This top line here, very important to remember, particularly, for yourselves, and I'm sure many of you are already aware, the county boards are not satellite offices of the state board. They function independently with oversight, as was mentioned, where we do provide oversight to ensure that they are complying with state and federal laws. But the county boards of elections are indeed their own entities. And they're the front lines for administering elections in New York State. Similarly, they are set up in a bipartisan manner, as we are. Each board will have 2 commissioners, one appointed by the Republican Party, one appointed by the Democratic Party. They may have additional staff below that, and the amount of that varies depending upon the individual county. But again, it tends to be very bipartisan in its nature. And all operations, all approvals, and everything in the day-to-day rests upon bipartisan approval. In terms of how we see our relationship with the county boards, it's meant to be very collaborative. We're not here to try to bring a stick down on them. We want to help them to come into compliance with laws in situations where they need that assistance, and to just ensure that continues. So we do visit boards on a fairly regular basis. Different units will coordinate visits for various counties across the state. We have monthly conference calls with all of the county commissioners and staff. Frequently, we are in communication with them across all of our units, providing guidance via email, taking phone calls, and having other communications with them. And we assist and participate in their biannual conferences. Next, please. We've also tried to collaborate and foster a collaborative relationship between ourselves, the county boards, and the county IT departments. This is something that I've been fortunate to be able to see really come to fruition in my time at the board. You go back a few years, very often the county boards did not have, depending upon the county, of course, did not have a particularly close relationship with their county IT. As cybersecurity became far more important to elections, both the state and county levels, it was obvious that needed to change. There needed to be that closer relationship. So we've gone well out of our way in trying to foster those connections. And we also try to maintain a connection with local county IT leaders ourselves. For example, there's the NYSBOE conference, and For anyone who may not be aware, NYSBOE is the New York State Local Government IT Directors Association. And it's participated in by a great many IT staff, both at the county and town and city levels across the state. We participate in those conferences on a regular basis. Ben just got back from there last week, in fact. We also encourage participation in EI-ISAC and MS-ISAC and membership therein. You probably are aware of them, perhaps with MS-ISAC at least, and Ben can certainly talk more about that if there are questions. We administer a number of grant programs here from the state as well, as we get federal dollars or state dollars that are to be provided out to the county boards. And very often that involves connection with county IT. We, a few years ago, began funding intrusion detection systems and managed security services for all of the county boards of elections. In many cases, those are also something that protects other parts of the county IT infrastructure as well. And I believe we'll talk more about that later on. And we do fund annual cybersecurity training for county board staff through our partners as well. Next slide, please. So I think at this point, I'll turn it right over to Ben.
Thanks, Mike. And just a quick introduction, Ben Spear, Chief Information Security Officer for the State Board of Elections. Prior to that, I spent 8 years at the Center for Internet Security, which most folks know through their state and local support, the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the MS-ISAC. I was an intelligence analyst there for many years, and then in my last 4 years, after the 2016 election, I was the founding director of the Elections Infrastructure ISAC, which was a unit within the organization established to support the elections community. And so just looking at this slide here is the conversation. Why are we here? And Mark sort of covered a little bit of that earlier, but I wanted to give a quick timeline of 2016 to 2020. Certainly, there's been some more as we're now in 2022, but I still think that's sort of the on-ramp, if you will, the runway that we have. And of course, it was in the summer of 2016 where Illinois reported that they had part of their voter registration information breached. And then there were reports of other potential compromises. None of it were confirmed, all of which were determined to just be attempts to look at systems without any success, potentially against every state at the time, as well as some activity on election night as well, where there was one state that had a election night reporting system, the results page, if you will, that had been compromised, but they were able to address that very easily, and there was no impact for the reporting of the results in any way. And that really was the instigator. That's when Homeland Security at the federal level, as Mark mentioned, the state and their teams, as well as the FBI and even the military in some cases, getting involved to identify and respond. And in January of the following year, in 2017, Homeland Security, federal Homeland Security, declared elections infrastructure critical infrastructure within the government facilities, which many of you fall under just by dint of your existence. But that allowed the community to establish a coordinating function with Homeland Security made up of state and local election officials, as well as federal partners at the FBI and DHS, and later CISA, which is a term you'll hear a lot, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is Homeland Security's major cybersecurity office. It was that time that the initial part, a pilot, and then ultimately the full-blown ISAC was established, which was an organization established to provide cybersecurity services and share threat information with the community. In the spring of 2018, Congress first appropriated $380 million for election security, and that money was distributed to the states based on population. And we'll talk a little bit how that money was spent in the next few slides. And that summer, using part of that money, the Board of Elections began our election security roadshow and the start of our armor plan, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides. where we actually went around and brought the IT and the county boards together to talk about cybersecurity, to run an exercise, and to really start to move forward our plan for how to secure the state's elections here in New York. November 2018 was the first election since 2018 where we had that big architecture had been set up with the ISAC, with CISA, with our other federal partners, with the state as well. Really a coordinated operation to protect and defend our elections, and that went very well. Then in December of that year, another $420 million was appropriated. Sorry, December 2019, I should have, that's actually a little off. December 2019, that additional monies was appropriated. And then it was in the winter of 2019 where we began some further support to the counties in identifying potential security gaps and then deploying technologies and then providing the funding to deploy technologies on their own as well. And it was in November of 2020, the big election, where certainly in those final weeks, not necessarily complete cyber activity, there was some cyber activity which supported actually mis and disinformation conducted by nation states in order to affect voting. And so with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide and talk a little bit about what we are securing here in elections. I use this chart. I used to have one that sort of was a matrix that showed different types of activities and attacks. And I think this really gets the point. All these arrows align. The first part on the left are various different election technologies. And a lot of times folks sit there and they say, oh, elections are different. But in parentheses there is what it is. And it's regular technology, right? There's nothing, the action it's taking is unique, voting or voter registration or checking in voters, but it's a tablet, it's a computer, it's a scanner that's scanning your ballot, right? It's a website that's reporting the results. And so the attacks that affect any of those systems in the real world are the same attacks that affect those systems. And so we can really take the similar approach into securing those systems. And the approaches we take to secure the election process, as well as the county boards, can be expanded in a way to support the county overall and provide some further security. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is where New York BOE established the ARMOR plan, which was we were going to assess the risk, remediate the vulnerabilities, monitor ongoing operations, and respond to incidents. This was a multi-part, and then you can see continuous monitoring and feedback plan to identify, fix, monitor, and then respond, essentially. And that is really an important part as we go into next slide, which are the programs that we have developed over the last 6 years. And this is what we're going to be going over today for the rest of this call here. These various programs that we've implemented over the last 6 years to support the county Board of Election and with the support of your county IT directors as well. And so Mark sort of went through this list already, and we'll move forward to the next slide. And before we even go that deep, I think it's very important to talk about all of the partnerships that we've had over the last few years in deploying this. The ISACs, as I mentioned, your own organization, the federal government, state, Homeland Security, Public Service, ITS, the county IT directors. Really, is a whole of government approach, as Mark said, and that has been critical for us to be able to succeed. This is not something that us or the counties would have been able to do on our own, and we really want to say thank you to all of you and those who have supported us as we've deployed this program. So with that, I am going to turn for the next 2 slides to Mike.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we did in terms of upping our cybersecurity posture was to establish a cyber incident reporting procedure. So there are multiple agencies. You just saw some of them who are partners of ours and others throughout the state who handle cybersecurity issues. And there had been some confusion at the county level, at the county boards, as to what should they do when there is a cyber incident. Who do we call? Who do we talk to? So we came up with this reporting procedure here, and there's some further detail about it. We distributed it as posters, as printouts, and then wisely, someone had the idea to distribute them as mouse pads. So many of our county board folks found that very handy because it was something that was ever present on their desks. The important thing is that when there's an issue that occurs, an incident occurs, the first call that we want the board to make is to the State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, to their response team. And the number is here. Again, that is staffed, as it says, 24/7. So that's why we want that to be the first call. It's the cybersecurity equivalent of a 911 call in this scenario. The second call would be to our Secure Election Center. And that is headed up by Ben with his team. And that's so that we're aware of what's going on. We can then analyze, see if it's something that we need to alert other boards to, for example, or we need to send upwards to federal partners or otherwise to respond and to assist. So this is the reporting procedure that was established there. Next slide, please. One of the things that we did, as we may have mentioned, was we paid for and contracted with an outside source, and we'll go back a slide, please. There we go. To perform a cybersecurity assessment for each county board. This happened a couple of years ago. We assessed, as it says here, both governance and from a technical area of focus. And again, I'm not going to read all of this through to you, but the governance had to do with various policies and procedures, making sure that the counties were doing the process things that they needed to do in order to keep elections secure. From a technical side, those are the kinds of things that your IT folks would be able to fully understand if we told them we were doing a technical cybersecurity assessment. These are the kinds of things that they would assume we were doing. Vulnerability scans, seeing if the bad guys can get in from the outside, or what happens if they're already in your network. What can they do from there? The results of these were then something that we compiled together. We had a vendor who developed some reports so that we could get a sense as to the landscape of the threats out there. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and then actually, I'm going to ask. I was going to do a little bit more on this. If you can go back, apologies. I also think it's important to understand, each of these tasks that we looked at are sort of gave a scope of what are the risks in the environment, and they supported the county writ large as well as the board in their analysis. But it's so important to understand what is on your network, right? So they actually just scan, because so many times we go to the office, right? How many of us log on to free Wi-Fi because someone gave us the password, or plug our laptop into our personal laptop into a jack? It allows to find those systems and then remove them, to understand what software that's critically important, to understand the connections in and out of the network, to see where the Board of Elections is talking to, so that we can ensure that if there's a potential risk point in, we can try to protect and mitigate that as well. And then certainly, as Mike said, those governance pieces are very critical, and really are a role that also involves leadership at the county as well, in terms of continuity operations and incident response, and the role there. So yes, we'll turn to the next slide to talk a little about what we did with the assessment afterwards, because this next step here although it was actually the most recent step we've taken, was sort of a culmination of several years of work. We call it the cybersecurity regulation, implemented Part 6220. It is a regulation that folks are required to be in compliance with, and there's an annual compliance report on August 1st each year. This is very simple, yes, no, and then if you're not compliant yet, we ask the counties to provide an expected date of compliance and their plan for coming into compliance. And they're really intended to work on this with their county IT, and then also establish a central responsibility within the board. While it's IT that's going to do a lot of the security work, a lot of the requirements in the regulation are focused on governance pieces, sort of how Mike described there, policies on continuity of operations, policies on access to systems, policies on responding to an incident. And while the IT department is going to help with that and respond to that, in reality, the responsibility has to lie with the executive officer in the agency, in this case, the commissioners at the Board of Elections, to actually ensure that that is being accomplished, right? And so we did ask each county to provide bipartisan election system security officers that are the direct contact for any security issue. And those are the ones who are actually held responsible, if you will, for ensuring that the regulation is implemented. And I should note that the regulation actually started out as a directive that we had initially started with just the base level pieces, and then we built over time. But those security officers, some counties do just use the IT staff, and some counties do use the commissioners or deputy commissioners as that contact. And then we also ask them for every year to provide us their updated incident response contact list, essentially a phone tree, if you will, within the county of who to contact in an incident, as well as their continuity operations plan. A little typo there, a little P should be at the end. Next slide, please. And it's critical to know that we didn't just do this in a vacuum. This regulation was developed in coordination with the county boards, as well as strongly with a county IT working group organized through NYSBOE. These are the counties, these are the IT leaders who assisted us in developing this cybersecurity regulation. So it's not something where the state just came down and said, hey, again, we're about a collaborative spirit. And even with the regulation in place now, that is the approach we've taken. We understand that some of these are going to take a little extra time. And our job here as the state board, as the Secure Election Center, as we like to call it, in my unit, our goal is to help you get there and to provide whatever support and guidance we can to get you to that particular level of security. And so we've really taken an approach where when someone reports, hey, you know, we're not there yet, we try to help. We try to explain where we can provide support to better able implement the regulation. Next slide. So this is actually what the regulation requires. These are the top level requirements. And as you can see, there's about 21 requirements. These ones that they're all very common things: data classification, identifying what data you have, and then determine its criticality. So you can determine what security should be in place for that data. Asset inventory, understanding what hardware and software you control. Patch management, ensuring that if there's a vulnerability and there's a patch from the provider, that it is patched very quickly, as possible. Vulnerability scanning. This is where you survey the network, you survey the applications to identify any vulnerable software or hardware that needs to be patched, where there is a patch available, essentially. So vulnerability scanning, as opposed to penetration testing. Vulnerability scanning looks at what are, based on the data available, the vulnerabilities based on the software that exists. Whereas a penetration test is actually someone actively attempting to hack your network with permission. That's an important part, with permission. And that is something we do require as well under the regulation, under this vulnerability scanning piece. Backups and restoration of data, so critical to ensure not that you're backing up data, but that it works. And so we do ask the counties to check 90 days before every election that they can restore. Network segmentation. This is actually separating out the network. We do require now that the Board of Elections be firewalled off, to be walled off from the rest of the county network. They still use county systems, you still use a county IT connection, but they have to have some sort of security device, some sort of protection to ensure that if there's an incident that happens in one part of the county, that it doesn't then affect the board, or that if there's an issue in the board, it doesn't affect the rest of the county. And this is one of our certainly weak points, one of the biggest gaps we found when we did our initial assessment. And one of the reasons it's still somewhat weak is a lot of it is technology related. It's physical technology needs to be purchased, and a lot of folks have been running into supply chain issues there. And so everyone's on the path there. However, it is something that is taking some more time because it is a bigger lift. It can often be a full infrastructure redesign. Many counties have decided as they go forward with segmenting the board, they might segment other offices because it's easier to do that all at once than it is to do it piecemeal in many cases, depending on how the network's organized. Remote access control. So we require certain security controls if someone's accessing the board from home or from somewhere else. Logging, ensuring that there is central logging. And logging is each system that you use actually provides a record of what is happening on that system, whether it's a computer, whether it's a printer, whether it's a security device. All of those have numerous records of what is happening on those systems, down to who touched what file, who logged into what application, who installed this or downloaded this. And so what we ask is that the county centralize that, and we've actually provided a service to help them with that to be able to meet the regulation. Incident response. Each county needs to have an incident response plan for cybersecurity incident. And they actually also have already from prior year requirements, response plans for various disasters, hurricanes, et cetera. We all know Sandy was an election day, right? So, or the week of election day. So everyone is familiar with that. And continuity operations plan, similar, something that we are requiring folks. Many of them already have annexes off of your continuity operations plan or have worked with you on those, but we do still have some that are outstanding, and we're encouraging folks and going to provide some additional assistance on it as well. Credential management and access and multi-factor authentication. This is your password security, right? Are you using strong passwords? And are you only letting people access systems that they need to access? Very critical security control. You know what? Sometimes the person in charge doesn't need to have access to a particular system, weirdly enough, very much like a clearance system, right? I have a boss who doesn't have a clearance, but I have one, and I can't tell him what I find out. He just has to trust that I'm handling it appropriately. And so similarly, ensuring that folks only have the privileges they need to do their job, and then multi-factor authentication for most accesses to secure election systems. We are requiring whether it's a token, whether it's an email, whether it's a fingerprint or an eyeball for some people, but I don't think anyone in elections is doing that. But very critical factor is to have that two-factor authentication, especially for remote access and for vendor access, because a lot of the vendors have access into the network or into the system, and we want to make sure that that is secured and not just open to anybody. Email and web protection. So we actually ask them to implement certain cybersecurity practices for their email, many of which are able to be built in if you have the Office 365. Very simple to just implement those with a toggle of a setting, as well as the web protections. Actually, a lot of the web protections that we require, this is to protect the website, because you all have election night reporting on your websites that show the results every election night. Actually, the premier provider for this web protection actually offers it. They're called Cloudflare. They actually provide that for free to counties that have elections, for elections offices specifically. And so that's really something that's easy to implement in many cases. Third-party risk management. This is one where we're asking folks to understand who they're buying from and who their vendors are buying from, and what are the risks associated with the security of those vendors and their vendors, really trying to better attack that supply chain component. A lot of this has to do with, for election systems, we do some of that. So something that I don't think we mentioned earlier is that certain election systems are actually certified or approved by the state board before they can be purchased by the county board. And that's primarily focused on connections to state technology and the functionality as it relates to the state functionality. That information, we do the third-party risk management there, but it's still important to do it just for your basic laptop, or maybe you're doing forms or your website has a vendor. You want to be doing that assessment of their security as well. And then a few here at the bottom, some of which we already provide, and I'll talk about it a little bit, but continuous monitoring and reporting, actual monitoring of the network, monitoring of activity from malicious activity, removal of media, USB drives, ensuring that you can't just plug a USB drive anywhere. That is something that we don't want to see, and we want to ensure that you're cleaning USB drives if you're using them for secure elections. They need to be properly, securely wiped. And then security awareness training and membership in the EII-SAC. And New York was one of the first states to have all their counties as members of the EII-SAC. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that there are some weaknesses. And so we have been working to help the counties by providing templates to meet those. One of those that we have already provided our instant response template, which includes that phone tree that I mentioned, to help.
Ben, we just lost your audio, actually. Can you hear us, Ben?
I think we lost you just after the phone tree, Ben.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, I'm terribly sorry about that. I don't know what happened to my phone there. But we're back. So instant response template, as I think I mentioned, I think that was before we lost the call. Just a way to review and have a process for if there's an incident, whose roles and responsibilities. Additionally, data classification. So initially, you need to identify what are all the data that I hold. Is it voter registration? Is it ballots, etc. This provides a tool actually provided by state ITS to then answer a few questions about the confidentiality. How confidential is that data? How important is it that that data is never changed, the integrity, and how important that information is available, how often the availability is required. And if there's any point at which it's a medium or a high, then that's where that stands. And it's something that it's very simple, but it can be complicated in the sense of, okay, how much data, how do I break out my data in different ways? And so we're actually gonna be doing a training for the counties and the IT directors on how to conduct one of these exercises. And then similarly, provide a worksheet for conducting conduct of operations. So often conduct of operations plans are 500 pages and no one ever reads them, right? They check it during an exercise. The reality is you're not going to be reading through 500 pages when there's an incident. And so what we're really trying to provide is something that's grab and go. You can just have it in your binder. So many election officials carry a binder on election day with the election law and various processes. Just throw that there as section Z and rip it out, and you have something to go on for identifying, again, roles and responsibilities and what those key functions are that you want to support. But the cybersecurity regulation clearly is a lot. We've done really good with the counties of getting them up to speed, and we're very close to full compliance at this point. But we weren't there at the start, and an important part there was getting the funding as well as providing some of the solutions ourselves. So I'm going to turn it over, Mike, to talk about risk remediation grants.
Great, thanks. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, we had the risk assessments performed through a state procurement with an outside vendor who went through and checked with each county board and did the review on both technical and governance side. The findings from those, as I mentioned, were compiled into a report, both on a larger scale, but also on each individual county scale. What we did is we partnered with NYSBOE, a cybersecurity consulting firm that some of you may be aware of and that we certainly have worked closely with, to have their teams go out and touch base with each county. And the purpose of that was to create a plan to remediate the issues that were found in that risk assessment. We split those remediations into short-term planning and long-term planning, things that needed to be fixed right away and that could be fixed right away, as opposed to things that were going to be a little bit more of a heavy lift and that we could have done a little bit further down the line. Now, at this point, all counties have made significant progress based on those plans. When those plans were created, it was in conjunction with a reimbursement grant that we were providing to the counties. Any line item in those risk remediation plans was available to be funded through this reimbursement grant. And that is available still to the counties, available up through December of next year. So they have until that time to actually apply for any remaining funding from that grant. Each county was allocated a certain percentage of funds based upon a formula that in large part rested upon the voting population of that county. The plans, of course, were, as I say, were done in conjunction with our cybersecurity consultants and were then fed in to us here at the state board. We reviewed them, determined that we agreed with the findings, worked with county IT and county board commissioners in order to make sure those plans really met the needs that we were looking for. And as I mentioned, at this point, all counties have made significant progress on fulfilling those plans. So, I'm very pleased with the how well this has improved the overall election cybersecurity posture here in New York. Next slide, please. And as part of that, in conjunction with those remediation plans, we also contracted with those same cybersecurity consultants to provide consulting services to each county. As it says here, we allocated 32 hours to make available to each county. Currently, about 40% of those are used. These hours are available out through 2027. So although not every county immediately knew how they wanted to use these services, they certainly have some time to figure that out, and we're encouraging counties to utilize them. Now, when I say encouraging counties, we are, of course, working through the county boards of elections. But again, in almost every case, this is in close communication with the county IT units because of the involvement of cybersecurity. In most cases, they really are working together on this. Some of the options for the consulting services, as you can see listed here, you're drafting policies and plans, including some of the ones that Ben just went over. General guidance on security practices is certainly part of this as well. Just good cyber hygiene, or for a particular network, for a particular configuration, what are going to be the best ways to secure that network and to make sure that it's at its the optimal security. And we also came up with a menu of what we call pre-packaged services, so things that are good to be done in just about any environment. And you can see those listed here. You know, reviewing your Microsoft 365 configuration, making sure that that is optimally secure. A responsibility chart for voter registration. Incident response planning, as Ben just was speaking about a moment ago. And application whitelisting assistance. So essentially knowing what are your trusted applications, your trusted addresses, and of course, you know, making sure that you're protecting against those that are not. Next slide.
What that does with the
ahead,
whitelisting is, what that does with the whitelisting is essentially, if you have that in place, only the applications that your IT department authorizes can run. If someone goes on to Chrome and tries to download something, it won't work. It doesn't work. And so that's something that we think can be very useful tool. And again, that responsibility chart also a great tool because it may be some work with their county IT, so it's about establishing those roles and who's responsible for what. Some is managed by us or by the vendor, and so helping counties understand what those roles and responsibilities are is a really critical part of cybersecurity there. And then, as Mike said, next slide, we'll go into a little bit of the direct cybersecurity support, as I like to call it. These are the things, many of which are part of the regulation that we decided were so critical that, or so easy to create broad security that we provide them ourselves. And so the first and the biggest piece was our intrusion detection and managed security services. This is something where we have an actual device that is at each county. Some of them protect just the board. Some of them protect the entire county. But that device is both intrusion detection, where it is looking for
We just lost you again, Ben. We can't hear you, Ben. Now, so I'm sure Ben will be back with us in a moment. The intrusion detection systems, managed security services, something we've been providing for a few years now, and we're actually looking at where we go from here. Yes, we can, Ben. You go right ahead.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's happening to my phone, but I've switched to my computer for now. We're on the last slide here, so hopefully it won't drop again. But yeah, the intrusion detection systems and then intrusion prevention. So depending on the county, it's up to them. It can actually be blocking activity that is seen. And what's important about a lot of these systems, they detect what we know about, right? So some devices, some systems, some which are being deployed. Many of you, I think, have probably heard about the CrowdStrike deployment from the state. Those also look at behaviors and can catch things that are unknown but look bad. Intrusion detection systems are really looking for things that we know are bad already, and that's really the tool there. And then I mentioned that logging. We talked about that a little earlier. All the systems, we want there to be a central location, and so we've provided a provider that will accept all of those logs and review them, and then also alert you if they find anything suspicious themselves. They alert the board or the county IT, excuse me. And some counties have chosen to expand their contract there to protect the entire county with county funds. And that varies from county to county how that works, but it's a useful tool to have it all in one place as opposed to on each individual system or we like to call it single pane of glass. That's usually the term in the cybersecurity field they like to use, being able to just look at one place as opposed to going to 5 different applications is very critical. We do provide the annual cybersecurity awareness training to the county boards and the county IT who support the board. That is something that we just said, you know what, it's easy for us to provide. It's a critical tool, so we just provide that. CISA, our federal partners, conduct annual tabletop exercises that we invite the counties to join. We're actually going to be doing our own as well coming forward in the next year. I mentioned we started with a road show. We went around the state when we first started this program, six parts of the state, and brought all the counties and IT together. We want to do that again. We want to continue to build those relationships, and that's an important part to check and ensure that, okay, you have these plans, but let's actually make sure they work. And then election day operations is probably our most critical direct support, which is, it's not just our job to tell everyone how to secure themselves. It's our job to help them if there's an incident. It's our job to help monitor and make sure there's nothing wrong on election day. And so we have a partnership with State Homeland Security, Federal Homeland Security, all of the FBI offices in the state, as well as ITS and Department of Public Service, DPS, Public Service Commission, to monitor and address any sort of incident that might be happening in that early voting and election day period. So we provide cyber support, we provide physical support. We've actually created a policy, and we're going to be doing a training tomorrow on dealing with physical threats to a polling place or de-escalation procedures. We work with DPS. We actually provide a list of all polling places, and that is provided to the utilities. And those areas are in heightened alerting during the election period. So actually, if an outage happens, it is prioritized to remediate the power outage in that area, and if not, to try to get a backup truck or something like that over there if the generator is not available immediately locally. And then, of course, increasingly an issue that we deal with is mis, dis, and malinformation. And this is something at the Board of Elections, we're not here to care about who said what about what candidate. Our focus is information about the election process. If someone says a polling place is closed when it's not, if someone says that the polls everyone votes on Wednesday, not on Tuesday, that's what we're looking for. That's the part that we care about and we're trying to address. And so that is an important part and critical to the integrity of the process. And then we'll turn to that last slide. It's a little bit of what you can do. Most importantly, particularly for the county executives and the administrators and the legislative chairman, are understand your role as the ultimate decision maker and the responsible party. Of course, the boards are sort of their unique entity, and the commissioners have
unfortunately, Ben, we lost you again.
So at this point, this is the last slide. I want to remind attendees that if you have a question, you can type that question into your questions panel, and we'll ask those. Hopefully, we haven't lost Ben for the rest of the time. I know we're creeping up on the hour here. It's Cybersecurity Month, and it's ideal, right? Because we're preparing for the election, and we know that the group here, Ben and Michael, have been working with our county boards for the last several years on strengthening the protections in our county boards of elections, right? So one question I have for you is, for those counties, you're working primarily with the IT director or the IT team in the county board of elections. Of those, how many of those are the IT director for the entire county, would you say, so that the work they're doing with the board of elections also bleeds over to the rest of the county?
If you're back, Ben, I'll
would say, yeah.
There you go.
I would say out of the 57 counties in the city, that probably in 54 of the counties, probably it's across the board. So
as a takeaway from here, having a conversation with your IT director about what's been going on in the Board of Elections and how you can bring this work that they've done in the Board of Elections to rest of county to help protect the rest of your systems. We're seeing incidents and ransomware and breaches that are happening in other parts of the county. Right now, as they mentioned, there's segregation, right? You've segregated the Board of Elections from rest of county. So if there's an incident in the rest of county, your Board of Elections is segregated and protected. So what can counties do, Ben and Michael, to spread out that security to other parts of their county?
Yeah. So certainly one is you can actually segregate other offices as well, right? You can segregate your 911 call center from the rest of the county, another popular target. You can separate out your finance department, another target that often gets invoices or phishing, in order to actually have, again, sort of that part I mentioned about access. It should be about where people should only get access to what they need to have access to. And so where you can support your IT in helping to separate that network out into different parts is an important part of securing. Additionally, it's so important, right? The part on this first one, I said you're the decision maker. Part of that is because so much of cybersecurity is policy and documentation. And the IT director or the IT security officer, if you have one, they can make recommendations for what to do. But ultimately, this goes for the county as a whole, not just for the board. You are the decider of what is the appropriate decision. So they can provide recommendations, and certainly they are the experts, if you will. But ultimately, you are the political entity at the top that's going to, for any decision at the county, that's going to be responsible if there's an incident or the like. And so you have to be the one to make the decision of, are we willing to take risk X, or do we want to mitigate risk X? And that is something that I think is a critical and important part of your role, and why it's important to understand cybersecurity to some degree, because while you do have IT security officers and IT officials, ultimately, as I say, the buck stops here, right? And that's going to be something that I think is very important.
An important note too is a lot of these resources that came from the federal government to the state government, and it came through the state Board of Elections because this was the focus of those regulations that were implemented several years ago.
Yes, yeah, and with that, a lot of that unfortunately means that the money, because of the way it was appropriated federally, is for securing the elections, and that's something to be aware of as well. And so where you can identify funding, whether there's additional funding through grants, through State Homeland Security, or just funding you're able to secure generally to expand these to the rest of the county, I think that's an important part for the wider county, is that you still need to look at that more broadly and what it would look like to expand it beyond.
Okay, great. Just last, I'll give you each another minute or so to just wrap up here as we're at the 3:01 mark. Michael.
All right. Not very much that I need to say here. I hope that this has been productive for you in understanding what we've done over the past few years to try to secure county boards of elections. And I absolutely encourage you to take a look at the rest of your cybersecurity exposure throughout the county and see if there are lessons to be learned from what's been done with the boards of elections, things that can be implemented otherwise. And we are certainly happy to provide any information that would be valuable along those lines.
Thanks. Ben.
So first I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today, and thank you for having us. And I apologize for the sound issues. But really, that if you can go back, that third bullet about facilitating communications, I think is the most important part. When an incident happens, you need to know who you're talking to. And yes, everyone might say, well, I know him, he's down the hall. But you need to have those conversations in advance about what you would do. You need to bring together IT, emergency managers, law enforcement, the board. Everyone needs to be on the same page. It's good to once or twice a year review what you would do, because I've seen it just in the last few months. When there's an incident, if you don't have those relationships, it's just finger pointing in various directions. Oh, he did it. Oh, you need to have those relationships. You need to be able to trust each other. Because it will come at some point to everyone. And so here's our easy contact information. Thank you again so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. So for our local government officials on the call, talk to your IT department, talk to your IT director, ask them what your continuity of operations plan is, ask them what your cybersecurity incident plan is. Have those conversations now and do a tabletop exercise so that you're prepared if there's an incident in your future. Thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it and your expertise and your experience in helping our county boards of elections secure the elections for this year and all upcoming years. So thank you.
Thank you very much.